All right, welcome to English BookCast. We're diving deep into a book you guys really wanted us to check out, Conspirators Hierarchy, The Story of the Committee of 300 by John Coleman. If you're liking these dives, think about joining the English BookCast channel and sharing them around. It helps us a ton. So you sent this one in. Looks like you're interested in what Coleman has to say about, well, a secret government running things behind the scenes. We're going to break down his main points, especially about this powerful group, the Committee of 300, supposedly controlling Britain and the U.S. He says he's exposing the real power players, so let's see what we find. Right off the bat, Coleman makes a pretty strong argument, right?
Yeah, he doesn't waste any time. He basically says the people we think are in charge, the leaders we see, they're not the ones making the big decisions. Not really. Not when it comes to politics or the economy, here or abroad. And what's interesting is he points out how most people either don't know this or they just, I don't know, accept it. Like they don't question who's really steering the ship.
It's like we're in this comfortable bubble, maybe. Easier to believe in the system than to face the idea that someone else is calling the shots. And that's what Coleman says lets this secret government thrive. He doesn't mince words, calling it an open conspiracy against God and man and their goal. Nothing less than enslaving humanity. Through wars, plagues, even mass murder. He lays it all out there. Pretty intense stuff.
Definitely intense, gets your attention right away. And to explain how this hidden control works, he uses this really interesting analogy. He talks about how in 1938, Germany had this new fighter plane, the Messerschmitt. They wanted to keep it secret, but instead of hiding it, they put it on display at the Paris Air Show. Bold move, right? Coleman says the intelligence community believes the best way to hide something big is to put it right in front of everyone. We're so busy looking for shadows, we miss the truth staring us in the face. Makes you wonder what else is hidden in plain sight, doesn't it?
It really does, that idea of being manipulated openly just because we're not paying close enough attention.
Huh.
Now, as Coleman digs deeper, he mentions some of the first countries targeted by this Committee of 300, specifically Italy and Pakistan. This book covers a lot, so what about these examples stood out to you as really showing what Coleman's claiming overall?
Well, the way he describes Italy and Pakistan, it kind of shows the tactics he says the Committee of 300 uses to get what they want on a global scale. With Italy, he talks about Aldo Moro, the former prime minister. He paints Moro as someone who pushed back against these zero growth and population control ideas, supposedly coming from the Club of Rome. And Coleman's very clear that the Club of Rome gets its orders from this higher-up Committee of 300. So Moro resists, and guess what? He gets on the wrong side of this powerful group.
And then he brings up this really specific and honestly explosive claim about what happened to Moro because of his opposition. A pretty big name in world politics is involved, too.
Right, he talks about testimony from someone close to Moro in a courtroom in Rome back in 1982. This witness said Moro was directly threatened by an agent from the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the RIIA. And this agent was also identified as a member of the Committee of 300. Who was it? Henry Kissinger, specifically when he was U.S. Secretary of State. Coleman says he'll get more into Kissinger's role later in the book, but thinking about this in the context of his whole conspiracy, it suggests this secret group went to great lengths to silence opposition. Makes you wonder how much power national leaders really have when faced with these supposed outside forces.
It's a serious accusation, that's for sure. If it's true, it would change how we understand that period in Italian history. And the Italy connection doesn't end there, does it? Coleman brings up Richard Gardner, the U.S. ambassador to Rome during Carter's presidency.
Yep. He does. Coleman claims that while Gardner was ambassador, he was actively working to undermine the Italian Republic. And he says he was doing it under orders from Bettino Craxi, who Coleman identifies as a major player in the Club of Rome and NATO. According to Coleman, Craxi was the driving force behind pushing divorce and abortion through the Italian parliament. These changes, in Coleman's view, weren't just social reforms. They were attacks on Italy's core religious and moral values, hitting the Catholic Church hard and changing Italian society at its roots. So again, we see this theme of the Committee of 300 allegedly using influential people and seemingly unrelated organizations to get what they want on a larger scale.
So the pattern seems to be anyone who opposes the committee gets targeted, while people in positions of power are used to reshape entire countries according to the committee's plan. Moving on to the U.S., Coleman talks about how they supposedly tried to neutralize any opposition here, especially after Reagan was elected. What about this stood out to you?
What's really interesting is this meeting, he says, happened in Washington, D.C. in December 1980, right after Reagan won. According to Coleman, it involved big names from the Club of Rome and the Socialist International, both supposedly under the Committee of 300's thumb. The goal of this meeting, come up with a plan to neutralize Reagan's presidency. And Coleman says they came up with a plan, and that it worked. Looking back at Reagan's 2 terms, he implies that what happened during that time proves it. Makes you think, if this is true, what policies or actions from Reagan's time would Coleman point to as proof of this?
Well, while he doesn't get into specifics about Reagan right there, he does move on to outlining the broader, long-term goals he attributes to this Committee of 300. He claims they work through this massive network, with at least 40 branch offices all over the globe, all working together for global conquest and control. That's a pretty organized picture he's painting.
It is. And the way he describes these goals, it's like a full-on attack on what he calls a civilized world, a world based on individual freedom, like what's in the U.S. Constitution. He frames it as a clear fight. On one side, the Committee of 300 wanting total control, and on the other, the principles of liberty and self-governance that Western democracies are supposed to be built on.
Now, to show how the committee supposedly works and how far it reaches, he gives this detailed example involving Pakistan and something pretty interesting, maybe even a little sensational, ELF technology. This whole episode, as he tells it, is pretty dramatic, even involves the death of a president.
It's definitely dramatic. He tells the story of President Ul Haq of Pakistan. He starts by describing how Ul Haq seemed to be going against the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR, trying to get more aid for his country. He even says Ul Haq was planning to kill Richard Helms, a former CIA director. But then Ul Haq dies when his plane, a C-130 Hercules, crashes after takeoff. What's really striking and controversial is that Coleman's pretty sure this wasn't an accident. He thinks the plane was deliberately hit with an ELF weapon, an extremely low-frequency weapon.
And this isn't just a guess, is it? He brings in some specific details, even though they might be debatable, to back up this claim.
Right. He refers to his own book from 1989, Terror in the Skies. He says in that book, he talks about something suspicious before the plane took off. There was this truck near the hangar before Ul Haq's plane left. He also points out how the plane was supposedly doing these weird loops before it crashed, a flight pattern he claims is a trademark of a plane hit by an ELF weapon. And get this, he mentions a joint Pakistani-U.S. investigation that found no pilot error or mechanical problems. To add more weight, he talks about research by scientists at these big Soviet institutes, the Kurchatov Atomic Energy Institute and the Lebedev Physics Institute, saying they developed these advanced radio frequency weapons. So he's saying the Soviets had this tech, which raises a lot of questions about who else might have these kinds of weapons.
It definitely adds a whole other level of intrigue and honestly a bit of fear to his story. Moving on from Pakistan, Coleman then focuses on how this Committee of 300 supposedly uses money and foreign aid to control things. What are the main points he makes here?
This is really important to his whole argument. He claims the Club of Rome and the Committee of 300 were totally against the idea of developing nations controlling their own natural resources. They saw it as a threat to their global plans. He then links this to the resistance against nuclear power in the U.S., saying the anti-nuclear movement was a deliberate tactic to slow down industrial growth, all part of the Club of Rome's post-industrial zero-growth plan. So the idea is, if developing countries can't control their resources and developed countries can't grow their industries, it helps the committee stay in control.
So they saw independent resource control and nuclear power as threats to their plan for global domination. And what does he say about U.S. foreign aid? How does that fit in?
He's pretty cynical about U.S. foreign aid. He says it's not about helping people at all. Instead, it's a way to keep countries dependent on the Council on Foreign Relations. He claims the money doesn't go to the people who need it, but to corrupt leaders who let the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, exploit their country's resources. He uses Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe as an example. He talks about how a company called Lon Arjo, which he says was run by a committee of 300 member named Angus Ogilvy on behalf of Queen Elizabeth II, controlled the country's chrome ore. The crazy thing is, even with all the U.S. aid, the people of Zimbabwe got poor, while Lon Arjo made huge profits. It makes you wonder about who really benefits from foreign aid, doesn't it?
It does make you question the real motives behind some of these international programs. Now, Coleman also brings in some quotes from Dr. Aurelio Pache, specifically from his books Human Quality and The Chasm Ahead, to explain the thinking behind this global governance idea. What did you make of those quotes?
Well, the way Coleman uses Pache's words, it shows this feeling of anxiety about where humanity's headed and a pretty negative view of human nature. He quotes Pache saying that man himself is the real problem, like we're our own worst enemy. What really stood out was the idea from The Chasm Ahead that without a one-world government, the future is just chaos and conflict. Coleman interprets this as Pache saying that only a global authority can handle the challenges we face. He even says Peche wanted NATO and the Soviet Union to work together to create this new world order, which would be in charge of crisis management and global planning. So it gives you a clearer idea of the thinking behind the one world government concept in this book. They think it's the only way to avoid disaster.
So it's not just an ideal for them, it's a necessity to prevent global collapse, in their view. And they even imagine rivals like NATO and the Soviet Union teaming up to make it happen. Coleman then talks about a big conference in Deauville and the release of two influential books, Brzezinski's Technotronic Era and Peche's The Chasm Ahead, linking them to a plan to weaken the U.S. in terms of technology and industry.
Right. He sees this Deauville conference as having one specific and pretty destructive goal: to stop the U.S. from advancing technologically and industrially. He argues that these two books, coming out after this conference, laid out the plan for how to do this. He focuses on Peche's argument in The Chasm Ahead about the need for a one-world government. Then he talks about the first global planning contract given by the Club of Rome, which went to MIT. Jay Forrester and Dennis Meadows were in charge of the research there.
And the report they produced, according to Coleman, was all about the same old Malthusian worries about limited resources and overpopulation. But Coleman completely disagrees with this, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He calls the Forrester-Meadows report a complete fraud. He says they ignored humanity's ability to innovate and come up with solutions. He specifically points to fusion energy, calling it the deadly enemy of the Committee of 300. Why? Because it could theoretically provide unlimited clean energy, which goes against their whole idea of scarcity. He even suggests that controlled fusion could be used to create essential materials from simple rock. It shows this clash in Coleman's thinking. She believes in human ingenuity, but he sees the committee pushing this limiting, pessimistic view.
That's a theme throughout the book. There are solutions, but they're being suppressed to maintain control through scarcity and dependency. And then he makes this wild claim that even the 1973 Arab-Israeli war was planned by Meadows and Forrester on behalf of the RIAA as a test case. That's a pretty shocking accusation.
It is. He says the war was deliberately started and manipulated to show the world that essential resources, like oil, would be controlled by global planners, meaning the Committee of 300 and their network. He then mentions the Tavistock Institute, which comes up a lot in his book, and how they consulted with Peche. This, he says, led to meetings with the U.S. president, cabinet members, the State Department, and intelligence agencies. His point is, the U.S. government knew exactly what the committee was planning from the very beginning.
So no plausible deniability for the U.S. government, according to Coleman. They were in on it from the start. Then he moves on to what might be the most disturbing part of his claims, the supposed plans for global population reduction.
Yeah, this is where things get really dark. He claims the Committee of 300 had a specific goal: to cause the deaths of 3 billion people by the year 2000. And how? Through wars, starvation, and diseases. He calls these people useless eaters. He even says Cyrus Vance, who was Secretary of State under Carter, was asked to write a report called Global 2000 outlining how to achieve this massive depopulation. And he claims this report was approved by Carter and Edmund Muskie, who was Secretary of State at the time, with the goal of shrinking the U.S. population by 100 million by 2050. If true, that's truly horrifying.
Extremely disturbing stuff. And he links these supposed population control plans to the ideas of Thomas Malthus and Friedrich Hayek, claiming Hayek was backed by the Club of Rome and controlled by David Rockefeller.
Right. He says the committee's economic strategies are based on the thinking of Malthus and Hayek. He even describes what he says was Hayek's plan for the U.S. economy. It includes some pretty extreme things like encouraging black markets, sweatshop labor, focusing on tourism, creating free enterprise zones that would attract speculators and even drug trafficking, stopping all industrial activity, and shutting down all nuclear plants. He presents this as a plan to deindustrialize and completely restructure American society, all to serve the committee's goals.
That's a radical vision he's attributing to Hayek, and by extension, the Committee of 300. He even names Jeffrey Sachs as Hayek's successor, saying he was sent to Poland after the Club of Rome supposedly caused their economic crisis, and that they had similar plans for Russia. The level of control and manipulation Coleman describes is mind-boggling.
It is. He portrays the committee as having this global reach, manipulating events through all these different organizations and people to get what they want in the long run. After talking about economic strategies, he then moves on to Brzezinski's Technotronic Era and this scary idea of a technotronic dictatorship.
Right, Brzezinski, who Coleman says is speaking for the Committee of 300, warned about the U.S. entering a technotronic era that could turn into a dictatorship. And this dictatorship, according to Coleman's interpretation of Brzezinski, would be kept in place through entertainment and distractions, basically keeping the masses pacified with an opiate for an increasingly purposeless mass, as Brzezinski put it. But Coleman's point is, Brzezinski wasn't just predicting the future, he was revealing the committee's plan, which was already in motion.
And what's unsettling is that Coleman believes they had already created this purposeless mass in the U.S. by 1991, pointing to unemployment and homelessness as proof. He then quotes Brzezinski's predictions about social conflict caused by new technologies and the possibility of mind control and genetic engineering. But he doesn't see these as warnings. He sees them as the committee's plans for how they'll maintain control in the future.
And a big part of this, he says, was the need for America to dismantle its industrial base and move into this new historical era where technology and manipulation rule. He even brings up specific examples of surveillance tech being used, like the Lourdes facility in Cuba and that huge NATO computer in Brussels, the one marked with 666. What do these examples mean for his overall argument?
They're there to support his claim that the Committee of 300 is running a massive, high-tech surveillance operation. He describes Lourdes as being able to intercept all kinds of electronic communications in the NATO computer as this massive data storage and analysis center. For Coleman, this proves that they're building this powerful system to monitor and control people on a huge scale.
It's a scary thought, this all-seeing, all-knowing entity pulling the strings. Now, Coleman shifts from these external threats to what he calls the real enemy within the United States. What's he talking about here?
This is where he goes from these outside forces to the danger inside the U.S. He says it's not communism, like people thought during the Cold War. It's traitors right here in the government, people who are secretly working for the Committee of 300. He tells Americans to focus on this domestic enemy, not outside threats. He sees the real fight as happening within the U.S., not from some foreign power.
So the enemy isn't some distant country, it's people within our own institutions working against us. After this warning, he turns to Mexico, saying it's another target of the committee's plans. What are their goals for Mexico, according to him?
He says the committee wants to keep Mexico poor and underdeveloped. They want to create a feudal peasantry, which would make it easier to control the people and exploit the country's oil. He claims they're doing this through innuendo, slander, and direct economic war against Mexico. He even mentions something called capital flight, where money is intentionally taken out of the country, which he says was organized by the committee's agents before Mexico nationalized its banks. So it's not just about controlling powerful nations, it's about keeping other countries weak and dependent.
So they're not just after power, they're actively preventing other countries from becoming strong. He then introduces the Tavistock Institute and its role in all this social engineering. This place seems to be central to his whole conspiracy theory. What does he say about Tavistock?
It definitely comes up a lot. He calls the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations the premier brainwashing institution in the world. He talks about their work with British soldiers during World War I, studying shell shock, and how they were heavily involved with Britain's Psychological Warfare Bureau. Then he claims that Tavistock's methods were used to get the U.S. into World War II. He also blames them for the Strategic Bombing Survey, which targeted German civilian homes instead of military targets, saying it was all about psychological warfare.
The fact that they targeted civilian homes is disturbing. It suggests they were trying to break the spirit of the people, not just win the war. And he says that later, NATO told Tavistock to focus on using brainwashing techniques on civilians. What does he say about this?
He talks about the Science Policy Research Institute, SPRI, at Sussex University in the UK. He says NATO wanted Tavistock to use their research on civilians, so they set up SPRI to do just that. He brings up the bombing of German homes again, saying it wasn't about stopping military production, which he claims was mostly owned by international bankers who wanted to protect their assets. It was about breaking the will of the people. Again, this idea that someone's pulling the strings even during a major war with goals beyond just winning the fight.
And he goes into how much influence he thinks Tavistock has on U.S. intelligence, especially the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI. What does he say about them?
He calls ONI the most powerful intelligence agency in the U.S., even more so than the CIA. He claims they got billions of dollars in government contracts and that people connected to Tavistock had a lot of power in the Pentagon, influencing military and intelligence policy. He even says there are over 30 research institutions in the U.S. linked to Tavistock and that they've infiltrated and control many government agencies and the whole policy-making process. It's like Tavistock isn't just some research group. It's embedded in the heart of the U.S. system.
He also mentions Dr. Alexander King, who helped found NATO and was a member of the Club of Rome. He says King was told by the club to destroy the U.S. education system by working through the National Teachers Association. The sheer scale of the manipulation Coleman describes is incredible.
It really is. He sees the Committee of 300 as running this long-term, coordinated plan to control every part of society, from governments and banks to social norms and how kids are educated. After Tavistock, he then talks about FEMA. What does he think about FEMA?
Well, according to him, FEMA isn't about helping people during disasters. He says it was created by the Club of Rome, and he sees the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident as a trial run, basically a staged crisis, to see how FEMA would respond and also to scare the public using the media.
Yeah, he doesn't believe TMI was an accident. He says it was planned to test FEMA and to make people afraid. He also says the media coverage, which was pretty intense, was deliberate and played right into the hands of the anti-nuclear movement. He even names William Paley, the head of CBS, who he claims was a former British intelligence agent, as someone who pushed this fear-mongering coverage.
It's a very cynical take on a major event, like it was all staged to serve a specific goal. He links FEMA back to the Strategic Bombing Survey and Dr. Kurt Lewin's ideas about crisis management, saying that now, instead of Germany, the target is the American people. What does this mean if he's right?
He's saying FEMA is using the same ideas as the Strategic Bombing Survey, but on Americans, not a foreign enemy. He mentions Margaret Mead's research on how Germans and Japanese reacted to bombing, and Irving Janis's report, Air War and Stress, saying they shaped FEMA's policies. He points out Janis's idea of creating fake crises and manipulating people through fear, just like Lewin's theories. He says this is exactly what happened with TMI, with the media, including women's magazines, used to create a panic about nuclear war. He even mentions a specific article in McCall's, supposedly written for Betty Bumpers by Tavistock.
The level of detail he gives, down to specific articles, makes it sound convincing, even if it's all very controversial. He then goes on to describe this vast network of think tanks and front organizations working for the Committee of 300, starting with the German Marshall Fund. What's so important about this fund?
This is where he tries to show how all these seemingly separate groups are actually connected and controlled by the Committee of 300. He names a whole bunch of people who he says are members of the German Marshall Fund and also have ties to NATO and the Club of Rome, including David Rockefeller and Willy Brandt, who he claims was a KGB agent. His point is, all these groups have the same people in them, which proves they're controlled by one central power, the Committee of 300.
He says that while the committee has been around for a long time, it took its current form around 1897, and it often works through front organizations like the RIIA. He also brings up the Bilderbergers and says Joseph Redinger was a key figure in setting them up. What's the purpose of these groups, according to him?
He says Joseph Redinger, a Jesuit priest and a 33rd degree Freemason, set up the Bilderberg Group, which he calls a foreign policy arm of the Committee of 300. He lists other people, like Catherine Meyer Graham from the Washington Post, Paul Hoffman from New York Life Insurance, John McCloy, and James Perkins from the Carnegie Corporation, as being founding members of both the Bilderbergers and the Club of Rome, again showing how interconnected these groups are.
He brings up Richard Gardner and Averell Harriman again, emphasizing their long involvement with this network, showing how their influence has lasted for years across different areas. Then he gives a longer list of other groups he says are fronts for the Committee of 300, talking about what each one does, like the Economic Committee of the North Atlantic Institute and the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. What are these last two supposed to be doing?
They're just more examples of how the committee uses different organizations for its goals, covering everything from economics and foreign policy to politics and social change. He says the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions was trying to rewrite the U.S. Constitution, pushing for liberal reforms while setting up a system with elements of monarchy and socialism.
He also talks about the Systems Development Corporation, SDC, saying they coordinate intelligence for the U.S. and Britain using surveillance technology all over the country. How does SDC fit into his story about control?
He sees SDC as a classic Committee of 300 project, handling all the intelligence gathering and surveillance. He specifically mentions NYCISIS, the New York State Identification and Intelligence System, saying it's like something out of 1984, a system they wanted to use across the whole country.
And he says all of this is part of a big opinion-making process that starts at Tavistock. It's so good, he says, that people think these manipulated opinions are their own, all thanks to the media and pollsters.
That's his main point, about how they control society without force. They use research institutions, think tanks, and the media to carefully shape and spread their opinions. The result, he says, is that people aren't really thinking for themselves because everything they see and hear is controlled. He uses the example of polling before World War II to turn Americans against Germany and Japan. Then he compares it to the Iraq War, saying they used the same techniques to make people hate Saddam Hussein.
If he's right, it's a pretty bleak view of free thought and public opinion. Then he makes this big statement saying the Committee of 300 has already achieved the transition to barbarism, and he urges people to take action against them. What's he calling for?
It's a powerful statement, showing how seriously he takes this threat. He wants people to stop the committee from creating what he calls a new dark age. He says it's up to ordinary people, not some higher power, to stop them. And he repeats that everything in his book is based on years of research and real intelligence, not disinformation. He's very adamant about that. Then he brings in the U.S. government, especially during Bush Sr.'s presidency, claiming they're not just being manipulated, they're part of the conspiracy. What does he say about the Bush administration?
He goes further than just complicity. He says the government is part of the problem, deeply involved in the conspiracy, especially under Bush Sr. He explicitly says Bush works for them, meaning the Committee of 300. He uses the example of Bush abandoning what he sees as key constitutional principles on May 27, 1991, as a win for Tavistock and their plan to attack the soul of the American people. So he's basically saying the highest levels of the U.S. government are compromised.
A complete condemnation of the U.S. leadership. He then talks about how the committee supposedly increased its control in 1986, leading to the Gulf War in 1991. How does he see these events? He claims that in 1986, a committee decided to put more pressure on the U.S. He uses the example of the U.S. recognizing the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, even though they committed genocide, as proof of this. Then he says the Gulf War was staged, based on lies, and that Iraq was a friendly nation that trusted the U.S. and was betrayed. He also mentions the personal computer card as a tool for future control and surveillance.
He sees these events as part of a plan to break down American society, to turn it from one nation under God into something divided and confused. What's the point of this trauma he talks about?
He thinks these events are designed to weaken the U.S., to destroy the values it was founded on, and to divide the people. He connects this back to Tavistock and their plan to make sure Americans no longer believe in the truths the Founding Fathers recognized. It's a scary picture he's painting.
It is a story of how American values and sovereignty are being deliberately destroyed. Then he gets into the drug trade, and he doesn't just see it as a criminal problem. He thinks it's a tool of control. What's his argument here?
He sees the rise in drug use, along with things like abortion, homosexuality, AIDS, bad education, divorce, murder, satanic rituals, missing children, and pornography. Not as separate problems, but as signs that the country is being intentionally pushed into chaos. And he blames Tavistock for orchestrating the cultural changes brought about by the Beatles, calling it the Aquarian conspiracy. He links this to the Changing Images of Man report by the Stanford Research Institute, SRI.
He doesn't see the Beatles as just a band, but as part of a plan by Tavistock to mess with young people. He even says words like rock, teenager, cool, and pop music were deliberately introduced by Tavistock as part of this manipulation. That's a pretty wild take on pop culture.
He says the Beatles were basically programmed to carry out Tavistock and SRI's plan. He even says Allen Ginsberg promoting drugs in the media was basically free advertising for this Aquarian conspiracy, and for NATO and the Club of Rome. He claims newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, which he says are controlled by the Committee of 300, help spread this message of decadence. He thinks the whole hippie movement was a planned social engineering project.
So not a genuine counterculture, but a manufactured one. He even uses the phrase, driven mad through psychological shocks and stress, which he says is straight from a Tavistock training manual to describe what they were doing to America. He also mentions how they studied drug use at Tavistock's Science Policy Research Unit, SPRU. What's the connection there?
He says SPRU was studying drug use to figure out how to manipulate people and cause future shocks. That's their term for the stress and confusion caused by too much information and choice. He says they deliberately spread drug use through the Beat generation, starting with the Beatles and free LSD, to force social and political change. He even suggests that descendants of the British East India Company, who made a fortune off opium, were involved in this new wave of drug dealing.
He specifically names people like Aldous Huxley and the Warburg banking family as being behind the spread of LSD through Sandoz. And he says Switzerland is a major center for money laundering, both by Swiss banks and by the Committee of 300's legal drug businesses. What's the importance of Switzerland here?
He sees Switzerland as a safe haven for the committee's money laundering. He then talks about why they prefer heroin over cocaine. It's more addictive and there's less scrutiny on where it's produced. He mentions the Golden Triangle, controlled by the Chinese military, as a major heroin source, saying it's too risky for outsiders to interfere with.
He even talks about the trade routes, how opium from Pakistan is traded for gold in Dubai, which is then used for heroin production. And he gets into the British involvement in the opium trade with China, saying it made every British monarch rich since 1729, with people like Lord Palmerston fiercely defending it.
He really lays out the history of British involvement in the opium trade, how profitable it was, and how the government, including the monarchy, protected it. Then he mentions the Golden Crescent, which includes Iran, Pakistan, and Lebanon as another big opium production center, especially after 1987.
He emphasizes how international banks help the drug trade, saying they fund companies that import chemicals for heroin processing. He even names the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, and he calls the Bank of International Settlements and the IMF bully boy clearinghouses for the drug trade.
He's basically accusing these big financial institutions of being part of the problem, saying they launder drug money without even trying to separate it from legal funds. He also says the TIR system, which was meant for transporting perishable goods, is being used by drug traffickers like Kintex of Bulgaria to move drugs all over Europe, even onto NATO bases.
He talks about the routes for raw opium and heroin, mentioning the Sicilian mafia and French labs, and the route through Iran, Turkey, and Lebanon, which he says was disrupted when the Shah was in power in Iran. He also claims that a lot of the big cocaine seizures you hear about are just for show, to get rid of competition, while the really big heroin shipments are protected.
He's saying the drug trade is controlled and protected at the highest levels. He even claims DEA agents are restricted in Hong Kong, which makes it harder to stop heroin trafficking. He brings up the Ochoa brothers from the Medellin cartel, saying they surrendered because they were promised they'd keep their money, wouldn't be harmed, and wouldn't be extradited. Basically, they could keep running their business from prison.
And he talks about Bush Sr. invading Panama and kidnapping Noriega, saying it was done on orders from Britain to protect the Committee of 300's banks there, even though they never found any drugs on Noriega. He sees this as a sign of what a one-world government would do.
He uses Noriega as an example of how powerful the committee is and how far they'll go to protect their interests. He says the case against Noriega was based on lies from criminals who wanted lighter sentences. He even mentions Carlos Leader, another figure in the Medellin cartel, who got a better deal in prison for testifying against Noriega, even though a former U.S. attorney called him a liar.
He goes back to how much money was made from opium, saying that by 1900, British oligarchs were making way more from it than even David Rockefeller. He also talks about how China tried to stop opium addiction after 1905, and how Britain pretended to help at first, but then encouraged China to start producing opium again.
He highlights how China tried to fight opium addiction and how Britain sabotaged their efforts for their own profit.
He then talks about families.